just indecent and unacceptable to be part of that. So at that point, you find a way to get rid of the diamonds, right, or something. You put them away. You never wear them again, right, because they aren't valuable, right, because they're not consistent with your other values. Okay, so that is meant to illustrate this very important distinction. It might seem kind of commonsensical and kind of harebrained and kind of primitive and dumb, but it gets a lot of work done. And Norton says that we can do the same thing with natural resource policies, right? We can run all the felt preferences that we have, right? Well, we want cheap electricity, we want cheap paper products, we want et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But once we understand how we get those things, maybe we won't want them so much anymore, all right? And at some point they might not become a part of our considered preferences, all right? So environmental pragmatism tries to determine not which resource management principles are true, but which are adequate to uphold certain shared intuitions about what is needed to live a good human life. All right, so let's distinguish environmental pragmatism quickly from conservationism. Conservationists believe that right natural resource policy is definable with reference solely to the felt preferences of all affected persons. There are no moral ideals apart from the ideal of maximizing satisfaction of affected persons' felt preferences. All right? So conservationists are all about felt preferences. Environmental pragmatists are all about considered preferences. All right? Environmental pragmatists deny that preference satisfaction is the only measure of right natural resource policy. Human ideals identified through the considered preferences of affected persons, the valuable, set limits on preference satisfaction. Right natural resource policy, or the valuable, cannot be determined with reference to felt preferences alone. All right, so the conservationists are just way off track, because they think, okay, man, people would rather, get this than that, so okay, that's the way we got to go. When a lot of people they only want this instead of that because they're ignorant, because they haven't really considered their preferences. All right, whereas environmental pragmatists say we can only make sound natural resource policy on the basis of preferences that we've actually thought all the way through. Okay. And once we think them all the way through, then we realize, hey, there are some pretty hard and fast limits on what we can do to satisfy our preferences, right? Like dumping all this stuff into our skinny little atmosphere might not be such a good idea. All right, so ideals such as living in harmony with nature provide leverage to transcend and criticize mere felt preferences. Considered preferences, the valuable, must be informed by such ideals. And all the great environmentalists in our history recognize that. All right, we're going to skip through that one. So this last human example, and then we'll go back and we'll do a little bit of a remedial, going back to these different normative theories in environmental ethics. But this is the famous example that I mentioned earlier in the class today. This Australian philosopher, Richard Rutley, in the early 1970s, and he comes from an Anglo-American analytic philosophy tradition. So he was pretty kind of an establishment philosophy professor in Australia, but he also happened to be have a love of outdoor recreation, and he identified with the environmental movement, the burgeoning environmental movement in Australia. So he started developing it. It's kind of similar to what happened with Arnie Naas, the guy that we'll study later in the term, who's much more important, much more influential, because he's kind of the guy who created deep ecology, right? But similarly, he was just kind of an analytic philosopher who also happened to be a mountain climber and an outdoor recreation enthusiast and an environmentalist. And so at some point it was logical for these philosophers to begin using their philosophical skills to analyze problems in environmentalism and natural resource policy. So Richard Rutley, I think the title of his essay was, is there a need for a new comma, an environmental, comma, ethic? I think that's the name of it. So, and he poses this dramatic question to introduce people to the idea that, in fact, the answer to the question in his title of his essay is yes, we do need a new ethic, because our old ethics are inadequate to account for the results of this dramatic thought experiment. And this is the thought experiment, the last human example. All right? The last human knows that she is going to perish very soon. All other humans have perished. In fact, even the squirrels and all sentient lives have perished, through some catastrophe of some sort. And but there's still life in the ocean. There's still plant life. There's a lot of plant life. The redwood forests and the Amazon are all, they're okay. But all sentient life is gone. Okay? So the question is, the last human, who, for whatever reason, she or he decides to push some buttons and detonate some nuclear weapons in the redwood forest, is the example that he uses. And the question is, very simply, is there anything morally objectionable about the last human blowing up the California redwood forest? Is there anything morally objectionable about that? Yes or no? If you're a classical anthropocentrist, is there anything morally wrong with it?
It's really nonsensical.
If you're an anthropocentrist,
It's an act of vandalism.
it doesn't really matter if you're an anthropocentrist.
Yes.
If you're the last person,
Yes.
then
That would be the strong, arguably the mainstream view. Arguably the mainstream Western view until fairly recently was the strongly anthropocentric view that there's nothing morally objectionable about the last human's destructive act, because the decision is not morally objectionable because only humans are morally considerable. All right? And that conclusion, right, follows logically from the axiological assumptions that most of us have about humans being the only value judgers, right? The only ones that make moral judgments. And so if there aren't any of those things left, no moral judgers left, how can there be anything morally objectionable, right? That is meant to, but then, right, so that's meant, okay, that's the logical conclusion. You accept this premise that humans are the ones with moral status, and the only ones with moral status, and so it logically follows there's nothing morally objectionable about the last human blowing up whatever she wants, right? Now, if there was a squirrel still left alive in the redwood forest, right? Now we've got something. Now we can say, okay, well, William James might say, well, there's a sentient being making a moral claim, right? And so that last human has to consider, perhaps, right? Or might consider. If the last human does consider, then yeah, then there might be a moral obligation. But if the last human is just a nihilist, like it seems like she might be, then to hell with it, right? Then, like in William James's example, if there are two sentient beings, but they just don't give a crap about each other, then there's still no moral truth, right? But if the last human gives a crap, cares a little bit about that lone squirrel over there in the redwood forest, then maybe. All right, but so that's meant to. These thought experiments are meant to, and this is the only thought experiment that really in the entire history of environmental ethics, because we don't need thought experiments. But this one kind of looms large just because it emerged in the literature at this really key moment when environmental ethics, around 1973, 74, when all this stuff was starting to move into the halls of a university. So we do like to talk about this one little thought experiment. But otherwise, we use just all real-life examples, right? There's an abundance of real-life examples, and we don't need to do any artificial thought experiments. But this thought experiment is meant, like other philosophical thought experiments, to lead you to kind of scratch your head and wonder, well, that doesn't seem right. God, that seems horrible what that last human is going to do. Surely there's something morally wrong with it, and yet it's also true that if humans are the only moral judgers in the universe, and now the humans are all gone, then, right? So you're supposed to kind of scratch your head, and it's supposed to make you think. And it's supposed to make you conclude that the answer to the question in the title of Professor Rutley's essay is yes, we do need a new environmental ethic. And this new environmental ethic may have to be a non-anthropocentric environmental ethic. Right? Certainly, if you're a non-anthropocentric, if you accept that there are entities in the universe, like even trees, redwood forests, that have moral status, then it's going to be very easy for you to explain why you feel a little bit queasy, right? You can't just say, no problem, go do it, right? Why do you feel uncomfortable with that? Well, it's because you know, somewhere deep in your heart, you know that the redwood forest has moral status, right? And so that means that our old assumptions, our old axiological assumptions are wrong. We need to challenge them. They must be wrong, right? Because they conflict with our intuitions, right? So, non-anthropocentrism is a very inviting view, right? The decision is morally objectionable because redwood forests are intrinsically valuable and therefore have moral status regardless of whether sentient beings are present to appreciate them or not. Okay? And then finally, Norton says, all right, this is Norton's argument. The non-anthropocentric view involves questionable metaphysical commitments, or questionable ontological commitments. Commitments to the nature of value, the nature of being, the nature of stuff, right? That are metaphysical in nature, that we can't prove or disprove. Okay? So he just says that's barred off. We can't go there because it's a questionable metaphysical commitment. It's non-anthropocentric view. It's just too unwieldy, right? It's too exotic. And yet we also don't want to go with the strong anthropocentric view either, because that just doesn't make any sense either. We know that there's something morally wrong with what the last human... So, aha! Let's see if we can find some compromise somewhere. And Norton proposes to resolve this whole conflict with this weak anthropocentric view. The decision is morally objectionable. Okay? The last human's act of destroying the redwood forest is morally objectionable. All right? So the strong anthropocentrists are wrong. Okay? It's morally objectionable, though, because it is not consistent with the considered preferences of a fully informed and rational person. A fully informed, rational person recognizes that ideals such as living in harmony with nature are part of a rationally defensible worldview. Destroying the last redwood forest would be in conflict with this ideal. All right? And this line of thinking lends itself very easily also to sort of a virtue ethics analysis, that would just say that's just in such poor taste, it's such an act of vandalism, it reflects very poorly on the human that's doing it. So regardless of whether or not the consequences, right? It's only a strict consequentialist that recognizes nothing wrong with that, right? But anybody who thinks at all about, virtue and integrity is going to have a whole host of concerns about committing an act of violence like that, right? Vandalism. So the weak anthropocentrist can answer, why it's wrong without having to commit himself to an exotic metaphysical commitment. See what I mean? So maybe he's onto something. So weak anthropocentrist is anthropocentric in the sense that natural resource values are determined primarily with reference to human values, but it's weakly anthropocentric in the sense that natural resource values are not measured by human felt preferences alone, but also by human considered preferences. And then we don't need to get into Parfit's paradox, although it is kind of interesting. So let's back up a little bit. And where are we? So we didn't spend very much time on egocentrism at all, but these are three coherent consequentialist normative theories. And this is just review. And we've done quite a bit so far in just 4 classes, right? Is this our 4th class?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. The best course of action for the utilitarian, just for review, is the one which satisfies the felt preferences of the greatest number of individuals. For the holistic consequentialist, I'm happy to call Brian Norton not only a holistic consequentialist, but even more narrowly, I'm happy to call him a holistic conservationist, right? And I think he'd be happy to embrace that title himself, a holistic conservationist. And that may launch us a little bit to that porous boundary region that I mentioned earlier between anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric, right? For a holistic conservationist, then we're going to be pretty darn concerned about the values of non-human beings. So holistic conservationism is what I'm trying to introduce you today as one fairly weakly anthropocentric, but still nevertheless anthropocentric set of principles to guide us in our natural resource policy. All right, and then to foreshadow the direction that we will take when we are done with the midterm, we will start getting into, we're still got a lot of work to do with Leopold and with Leopold as a consequentialist, but we'll then move into some other interpretation. Well, we'll get into some non-consequentialist arguments, all right, and a little bit of reevaluation of what Leopold's all about. Perhaps he's not so much of a consequentialist and a neo-Humean. Perhaps he's more of a neo-Kantian, and perhaps he is a bit of a deontologist. So anyway, the deontological form of environmental ethic follows the Kantian argument. These are the neo-Kantians, right? The natural law theorists we've already studied. We've already studied these guys. We didn't study Muir, we didn't read Muir, but I talked quite a bit about John Muir and pointed to the natural law elements in his defense of wilderness preservation, protecting Hetch Hetchy. And then our other natural law theorist that we encountered was, of course, our friend Ron Arnold. He's relied quite heavily on natural law arguments to defend a resource extractivist point of view. So for a natural law theorist, the best course of action is the one which is most consistent with the natural design of the universe. Right? For a virtue ethicist, and we'll get to virtue ethics right at the end of the term, the best course of action is the one which is most consistent with the cultivation of virtue. Eudaimonia, of human flourishing, practical wisdom, and arete, which is another word for virtue, individual human excellence. And this is actually a page of notes that I went over last class, I think. But it's just, you won't encounter other philosophy classes, I don't think, but that will talk about holistic consequentialism. But there's kind of this undeveloped blank spot where the utilitarians come out of the an empiricist. The utilitarians I mentioned, they're kind of neo-Humeans, but there are also these thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith themselves who are very reluctant to reduce all value to just an individual value, right? They seem to be much more open to the idea that collections, that wholes, that communities are independently valuable and have moral status. And probably it's not until Leopold comes along that we really start to wrestle with this point of view. What does that mean? Holistic consequentialism. The thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. What kind of argument is that? Is that really a consequentialist argument? It sure seems like it, but it also, there's a lot of work we have to do to identify what those terms mean. What is the integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community? And if those things are valuable, then in what sense are they more valuable than, for example, the human goods and services and benefits that we get from clear cutting, from strip mining, from fracking, from drilling, right? And that's the real problem. When push comes to shove, how can the integrity, stability, and beauty of an ecosystem be more valuable, more important than the feeding of a community of human beings or the electrification of a rural community of human beings? You know what I mean? So there's a lot of work to do is what I'm saying, and I'm just I'm doing my best to get us to organize, to try to understand the philosophical foundations of Leopold's point of view. And it's not clear what he is, whether he's really a consequentialist or some kind of a deontologist. All right. So there's our friend William James again. And what else did I say I wanted to go through? Well, so salmon. All right. How many people know about? How many people? Should I talk about salmon for a while? Just kind of the history of this resource. This is a very advanced page of notes here. But I notice right in the middle I talk about the Snake River salmon population. But environmental pragmatists are going to have a unique interpretation of the value of protecting salmon, or the value of restoring a river, or the value of protecting an old growth forest. It's pretty advanced there, that top of the page of notes. That could also describe deep ecology. That could probably describe social ecology and a lot of other some other environmental ethics traditions that we'll cover later in the term. But the environmental pragmatism would fit very neatly alongside both deep ecology and social ecology. And I didn't include it originally in the syllabus just because it was too much. Even though it's a tradition that I kind of come from. But we managed to sneak it in just because I got caught up, I got ahead of myself, and the movies didn't come through for me, and the speakers now aren't working. So anyway, but environmental pragmatists offer a description of valuing and a theory of value which they contend are more accurate, more consistent with human experience in valuing than the descriptions of valuing and theories of value offered by other environmental ethicists. So, and here I reference two philosophers we haven't even read yet. So. Anyway, but for example, let's think about restoring Snake River salmon populations. Why do people talk about the Snake River salmon populations? Why do people talk about the 4 lower Snake dams? You guys have some idea, right? Because I mean, you've been at PSU long enough and lived in this area to have heard, vaguely things about. That was the breadbasket of our salmon, of Columbia Basin salmon populations. The most valuable, about 40% of the fall Chinook, which are commercially the most valuable salmon. Right, these are the ones that get really big. Originated historically, about 40% of those really valuable runs of salmon originated in the Lower Snake sub-basin and its tributaries. Mainly the Clearwater and the Salmon rivers, these magnificent rivers that come out of the western side of the Rocky Mountains, right, and they drain into. The Columbia River is really quite an extraordinary geological phenomenon because it is the only river that cuts through the Cascade Mountains and through the. If you look at the whole Pacific coast, there are no rivers that originate in the heart of the continent, on the western slope of the Colorado, of the Rockies, and then go directly into the Pacific Ocean. Right? The other ones all kind of skirt around, like the Colorado goes way south and goes into the Gulf of California, right? And it avoids the mountains, right? But the Columbia just says, to hell with it, man, I'm just going to go right through the mountains. And it did, through the Missoula floods, right? These giant ice, would break. There was a giant lake, right, in Montana, covering Montana and Wyoming, and North and South Dakota, parts anyway. And this is a lot, obviously before the last, during the last ice age, I guess. Anyway, but when the ice broke off, periodically, it's happened several times over the course of, I don't know, 100 years maybe or longer. But the ice holding back the Lake Missoula would break, right? And these giant walls of water, we're talking like a 100-foot wall of water traveling 50 miles an hour, just tearing up everything. And you can see evidence of the Missoula floods all along here, all along the Willamette River. They have what they call glacial erratics, is that what they're called? Right, the rocks that get carried down on the glaciers. They don't belong here, right? There are types of rocks that don't belong, they belong here now, but they originate way, way east of here. And they literally got carried down on the backs of ice, glaciers, right, and then deposited way over here. And a lot of the landscape around here was formed by these Missoula floods. Anyway, and the Columbia Gorge is that section of the river that carves its way through the Cascades. You have Mount Adams on the north side, and then you have Mount Hood on the south side. And the river just powered its way right through there. And that happens to be, that section of the river was mostly whitewater before we started engineering the river. And that was also where most of the traditional fishing sites of the mid-Columbia Plateau indigenous peoples were located there, between where Bonneville Dam now stands to about 10 miles east of the Dalles is where Celilo Falls was. But that's about a 50-mile section, I believe, 40 to 50-mile section of river that carves through the gorge. And now it's all just slack water, right? It's just lakes, right? It's reservoirs. But in the old days, it was all mostly white water. And salmon were challenged, they had to take a certain clearly defined route to get up through that section of the river. And so that's why hundreds and hundreds of traditional fishing stations were located there. It's a very, very lucrative place to go fishing. What am I looking for here? Let's just get a map of that. No, that's not a very big one, is it? It's not one. Okay, there, that's the one I was looking for. All right, so there we have our river. The red dots are all Army Corps of Engineer dams. The yellow dots are either other federal agencies or local local utilities companies built the other dams. But most of the yellow ones are other federal, like the Bureau of Reclamation built Grand Coulee, and then the Army Corps of Engineers built all of these dams. It's kind of amazing, but these are the 4 lower snake dams here, and these are the 2 rivers that I was referencing earlier. I always forget which is which, but the Salmon and the Clearwater drain out of the western slope, right? This is the Rocky Mountains all in through here. This Rorschach Dam is a big fish killer too. But you can see how a juvenile salmon, that's the problem, okay? Yes, there are fish passage facilities in all of these dams. That means that adult salmon have fish ladders that they can use, and that they do use, to get around all of these dams. As the big guys are swimming upstream, right? But for every fish that goes down, for every adult fish that migrates back up, you need about 100 or 1,000 baby fish, because there's such a high mortality rate at every stage of their journey, right? So you need to have passage of juvenile salmon every spring or different times of year, depending on the subspecies of fish. But they have to go through all these dams. There's no safe way. There's no safe way. Now they have the turbines all screened off, so they're not going through the turbines and getting all chopped to pieces, right? But they still have to go over the spillway. And that makes them sick. It makes them really sick. Nitrogen supersaturation. And then they get preyed upon by the birds and everything. It's just a really bad situation for the juveniles. So bad that the Corps of Engineers for many years has actually been collecting them, trapping them here, and putting them on barges. And they take about half of them. They trap about half of them, of the juveniles. And then they put half of them on barges or trucks, and then the rest of the other half they allow to go down, you know. And they find that the mortality rates are about the same, actually, so it doesn't matter. But they take half of them out of the river and then drive them. They drive them down this freaking road and they let them off down here, right? Literally, this is what our government agency has been doing for 40 years now, basically since these Snake River dams were built. We've been doing that to mitigate, right, to offset, ostensibly to mitigate the catastrophic ecological effects of these dams. But this is why people talk about these 4 lower snake dams, right? We removed Condit Dam, which was right here on the White Salmon, the Little White Salmon River, right? That happened about 3 or 4 years ago. My friend who was going to come and talk about, Steve is going to talk to us about the lower Snake River. He also is going to talk a little bit about that. He was there when that dam got blown apart, and there was a party and everything. But anyway, and that was a pretty big dam. It wasn't as big as these ones, but these guys are next. And these guys produce 4%, very small amount of electricity. They're run-of-the-river dams, which means they have no flood control benefits at all. They do facilitate barge traffic, right? You can take ocean-going vessels all the way up and down to the port of Lewiston. This is the port of Lewiston, Idaho, right here. And there's slack water and locks, right, to take these giant vessels all the way up and down. And those are really the only tangible, non-fungible values that those dams provide, but they're not really values either. Actually, every barge, Stephen will tell you that every barge that moves up or down that lower river is down this lower snake right here, every barge that travels to the port of Lewiston is subsidized by taxpayers in a huge amount, by like $40,000 per barge or something, just to pay for the infrastructure that these barges are using, right? And they could also, if they didn't have this infrastructure, they'd have to use the rail, which actually in many ways is far more efficient. So, but the 3 purposes that are championed, that are highlighted by dam supporters are flood control, hydropower, power generation, of course, and barge and navigation. Those are the 3 sets of values that dam supporters have traditionally used to argue that these dams are beneficial to us. They're a good idea. But we're down to 3% of historic populations of salmon. 97%. We were the most lucrative and valuable salmon fishery by far that the world has ever known. And now we've really made a mess of it. And the only way to get part of that abundance back is to start taking out these dams. And these 4 are the first to go right here. This is the Dalles Dam. Celilo Falls would be right about here, in between McNary and in between John Day and the Dalles. That was where Celilo Falls was. And as I said, so this whole section of river, Lewis and Clark's counted 454 fishing stations. in that section of the river. And they're all underwater now. And these are, the language of the treaties. We'll go over that too much later in the term, but the language of the treaties says that the signatory, the Native Americans who signed these treaties, reserved the right to harvest fish in all of their usual and accustomed places, off reservation, right, and on reservation, of course, but everywhere, right? They reserved, very powerful treaties, right? They reserved the right to harvest fish at all their usual and accustomed places, in common with citizens of the territory, which later was interpreted to mean 50% go to the Indians, which was a big deal, which still is a big deal in this area, this treaty area up here. That was the fish wars going on. But if you think about it, it's just kind of shocking and dismaying. How could this happen? Well, it could happen just through racism and economic power and might makes right, and we're going to do this, and we're in the Cold War, but we've got to fight, we've got to generate power as much as we possibly can, because the Soviet Union's generating power. They're doing this too, so we need to do it. At some point, the return that we get, the way I understand this is later on in the term we'll talk about these harvest sites, but this is a whole fishery. This is a whole fishing cycle. A salmon ecosystem is a cycle, and humans are an essential part of that cycle. And the cycle, you could say, originates in here, right? In their fish, right? These are the June hogs. The June hogs are the ones that these guys got pretty big too, but the really big ones, they went all the way up there to British Columbia. It's all slack water too, by the way, except for here. This is the only free-flowing section of the Columbia River other than the estuary. This is the estuary, this is all estuary, right? We're part of the port in the estuary, and there's tidal influence here too. And you see the water that will go, even in the Willamette here, there's tidal influence. But anyway, the June hogs would travel on. They call them June hogs because they migrated during the summer months, and they got pretty big, pretty damn big. Guess how big? The biggest one. Take a guess.
Big as a hog?
No. But they looked like it. 135 pounds.
Jeez.
5 feet 3 inches long. 135 pounds. That was caught, probably in the 1930s. But those guys are all cut off. This is the end of the line right here. There's no fish passage after this dam. I think the Wenatchee flows in somewhere around in here, and that's kind of the end of the line for salmon. If they want to turn off, they can go up there and spawn up there, but they can't access this region anymore. And the June hogs are all extinct. They tried to save them, though. That's another story. People were aware. They knew, mostly for commercial reasons. Obviously, why would you let such a huge fish go extinct? It's very valuable. It's going to bring a lot of tourism, and people want to catch those things, right? Plus, they're valuable in the ocean, right? People catch them out there, and then they feed a lot of people. So why would you do that? And they realized that, so they actually transplanted them. They caught them. They put traps in right here, and they caught them. This was during, in the late 30s, right, while they were building Grand Coulee Dam. Grand Coulee Dam was finished in 1941. So for about 5 or 6 years before 1941, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service went out there